Hey everyone, this is the last video for this chapter, and we are going to be talking about cell membranes. We'll talk about phospholipid bilayers, the fluid mosaic model of cell membranes, and then we'll talk about transport across cell membranes. And by the end of the video, you should understand the structure of a cell membrane and understand the three different types of cell membrane transport. So let's talk about phospholipid bilayers. So recall that phospholipids had a polar head region and two nonpolar tails. We abbreviated this phospholipid as the circular polar head and the nonpolar tails. Now, when you mix these in water, the nonpolar tails don't want to touch water. And so what happens to these phospholipids is they aggregate together and they point all their tails inward, similar to how soap molecules made that micelle, except the phospholipids have two tails, and so they don't really form micelles, they form these bilayers. And so they stack in a double-layered conformation where all the heads point outward towards water, and the tails point inwards and touch each other. And they pack so tightly that there's no water molecules in here. This is completely void of water. It's like a little oily layer with the polar head groups on the outsides. So this is known as a phospholipid bilayer because it's two layers tail to tail. Now, cell membranes are the outer perimeter of cells. And these cell membranes are made from phospholipid bilayers. And so that's the main purpose of phospholipids in your body, is to form the membrane around every single one of your cells. So you can imagine your body has a lot of phospholipids in it, right? It's literally the membrane around every single one of your cells. And even the membrane of the nucleus and the membrane of your organelles, those are all phospholipids. But there's a lot more complexity to it than just the phospholipid bilayer. And so we're going to take a closer look at the cell membrane, and we'll talk about all of these components. And so we call it the fluid mosaic model because I want to zoom it in here so we can see it a little better. The cell membrane is not rigid. It's not like an eggshell. It's like a waterbed. It's semi-fluid. It can move. Things can diffuse within the membrane, but it is robust, right? Your cells don't just burst open spontaneously and spill their insides out. Like it stays together, but it's got some fluidity to it. And there's a lot of different components embedded in here. And so that's why we call it a mosaic. A mosaic, or like, people take tile and break it up and they glue it to a wall to make a picture, but it's made from different pieces of different broken tiles. It's called a mosaic. And so we call this the fluid mosaic model because it's got a lot of different pieces going on and it's semi-fluid. So it's the fluid mosaic model of cell membranes. Now let's take a look at what's going on in here. So in green are all of the phospholipids, the bilayer. That's the main component. It's mostly a phospholipid layer. But embedded within the phospholipid bilayer are cholesterol molecules, shown here in yellow. Now remember, cholesterol is one of those steroids. It has a single alcohol OH group, which likes water. The rest of it is nonpolar. And so those steroids orient themselves within the phospholipid bilayer, where the core of the steroid is in there with the non-polar tails, and the little OH group is sticking up with the polar heads. Now, cholesterol, because it's got those fused rings, is like a board. It's stiff. if you didn't have cholesterol embedded in here, your cell membranes would be too fluid. They would be like oily and they would come apart too easily. The cholesterol being rigid like a board, when you embed it every so often, it sort of keeps the tails in check. Normally those tails want to flop around, but if you've got a cholesterol next to it, it sort of stops them from flopping around. It's like when you're teaching kindergartners and you got all the kids who just want to goof off, and then you got like the one serious kid, and you sit the serious kid at the table with all the jokesters, and he tries to like keep them in line. That's kind of what's happening with your cell membrane. The cholesterol is a stiffening agent, and it keeps the fatty acid tails from flopping around too much. It kind of keeps them in place. And so it gives a little bit of rigidity to your cell membrane. And interestingly enough, different organisms have different amounts of cholesterol within their cell membranes, depending on the temperature in which they have evolved. So organisms that live like in glaciers, like glacier ice worms, where it's super cold all the time, they actually need their membrane to be more fluid because the cold temperature stiffens it already. And so they actually have less cholesterol. And then organisms that live in like boiling hot geyser water, where it's really hot, well, their cell membranes are trying to melt because it's already so hot. And so they have more cholesterol to try and keep their cell membrane more stiff in the hotter environment. So the amount of cholesterol can vary from organism to organism, but it always serves the same function to stiffen the cell membrane a little bit. Now, these blue things here are proteins. And you can have proteins embedded within the membrane. If they cross the entire membrane, they're called a transmembrane protein because they transverse the entire membrane. And a lot of these proteins act as access pathways for nutrients or waste products to travel in and out of the cell. Some molecules are too big to go through the cell membrane on their own, and so they need like a little doorway to get through. And so these transport proteins allow nutrients in and waste products out. You can also have peripheral proteins, which only interact with one side of the bilayer, either the interior or the exterior. And a lot of times these act as signaling molecules. So like hormones or other signaling molecules will attach to these surface proteins. And when the signaling molecule attaches, it triggers some downstream effect in the cell. And so a lot of receptors are surface proteins. And then attached to some of the surface proteins can be these carbohydrate side chains. So chains of sugars, and these can act as signaling flags, if you will, so that, other cells can recognize this cell. It's kind of like when sailors would sail in the ocean back in the day, you would fly the flag of your country so people in the distance would be like, oh, it's our countryman, or oh, that's a pirate, cells have these carbohydrate chains which identify the type of cell it is. That's actually what your blood types are. Blood type A, B, AB, blood type O are different sugar groups on the outside of the red blood cell surface proteins. And that's how your immune system recognizes those as natural blood cells or like invader, right? And so that's why if you get a blood transfusion from somebody with the wrong blood type, your body attacks it because it's got a different sugar chain. It's flying the pirate flag and your body thinks it's an invader, so it attacks it. So carbohydrate chains attached to the proteins can serve as identification markers. And so there are other components, but that's about all we're going to talk about in this class. If you take like a cell bio, you'll look at all these details. So phospholipid bilayer, embedded cholesterol, embedded proteins, and some of those proteins have sugar or carbohydrate side chains. And we talked about all that. So let's talk about the transport mechanisms. So there's basically three ways to get molecules across a cell membrane, either a nutrient getting into the cell or a waste product getting out of the cell. The three pathways are simple diffusion, and that's for like really small molecules that can pass right through the cell membrane. They don't need any special access. They can just diffuse right through it. There's facilitated transport, which is when you have like a channel protein that allows it to get through. And then active transport is a protein that has movement and physically like grabs a molecule and pumps it across the membrane. So diffusion or passive transport, facilitated, and active transport. And so I have a nice diagram here for us. So here's the outside of the cell. Here's the inside of the cell. Now in red is simple diffusion. Small molecules can just go right through the cell membrane. And this typically happens based on concentration. If you've got more of them on the outside and less of them on the inside, simple diffusion makes them want to spread out evenly. And so they will go from the high concentration to the low concentration with no help needed. Now, facilitated transport is for molecules that are like a little too big, and they can't just go right through the cell membrane on their own. They're too big. They'll like bounce off. And so you could think of simple diffusion as like mosquitoes. Even when you close your screen door, somehow they sneak through. They're just so small, they just go right through. There's a ton of them outside. There's none of them in your house. And so they want to go into the house to spread out. This is like your dog. Okay. When you close the door, your dog can't just get through the screen door. He's too big. So what do? You have a little doggy door. It's just big enough for the dog, but too small for anyone else. And so facilitated transport has a protein channel that's like a doggy door. It's just the right size for just that molecule, and it can slip through. And so it's still going from a high concentration to a low concentration based on diffusion, but it's facilitated diffusion because you give it a little channel to diffuse through. Now, active transport is the opposite. This is for large molecules when you want to push them against the concentration gradient. If there's more of them outside and less of them inside, they want to go in, based on diffusion. But what your body's doing is actively pushing them against their concentration gradient. And so it requires energy. And that's why it's known as active transport. And so this would be like you're throwing a house party and, you're trying to kick everyone outside. They want to come inside, but you're having to grab someone, open the door, throw them outside, and then close the door. It takes work to keep throwing everyone outside because everyone's already out there and they want to come in. So you have to actively push them and cluster them all on one side. So simple diffusion, facilitated transport, and then active transport, which requires energy. So those are the three types of transport across a cell membrane. We talked about the fluid mosaic model, which describes cell membranes, which are based on a phospholipid bilayer. That's it for this video, and that's it for this chapter. Thanks for watching along, and I will see you in class on Tuesday.